Christmas Eve, 2003. Portland, Oregon shivers under a blanket of freezing rain and fog so thick it swallows headlights whole. A green Ford Explorer rolls away from a quiet neighborhood, carrying 5 lives, a father, a mother, and 3 children bubbling with holiday excitement. Gas station cameras catch them once. A small cafe in Hood River catches them again. Then, nothing. No skid marks. No wreckage. No goodbye. The Matthews family simply disappears. Now, picture yourself there. You're on I-84, driving through the Gorge that night. The road curves, the river growls below, and in your rearview mirror, you see headlights vanish into the mist. Would you shrug it off as fog? Or would you wonder if you had just watched a family's final moment? For years, police leaned on the easy answer: accident. A slip into the Columbia River, hidden forever beneath the current. But families don't just vanish without a trace. And in the shadows of this story lies something darker. A neighbor with a grudge, a stranger in the corner of a cafe, and evidence that waited nearly 2 decades to rise back to the surface. This isn't just a disappearance. This is one of Oregon's most haunting cold case files, a story where every clue feels like a ghost tugging at your sleeve. Because sometimes, cold case files don't stay buried, they scream to be heard, even after 20 years of silence. And that's where you come in. If you've ever felt the pull of a mystery that refuses to fade, this is your story too. Stay with us as we uncover how a quiet Christmas Eve turned into a chilling riddle of debt, betrayal, and murder. Don't scroll away, hit subscribe, tap the bell, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Your voice helps keep these stories alive, and together, we'll make sure the Matthews family is never forgotten. After leaving their neighborhood, the Matthews family headed east, their Ford Explorer humming steadily as the fog grew heavier. David Matthews kept both hands on the wheel, leaning forward as if willing the headlights to cut farther through the mist. Karen glanced at him, sensing his tension. She adjusted her youngest daughter's scarf and whispered, "Almost there, sweetheart." The older kids in the back seat giggled quietly, trading guesses about gifts waiting under the tree. At 7:15 p.m. The SUV pulled into a gas station in Troutdale. Security footage later revealed a snapshot of ordinary life. David pumping gas while Karen wiped condensation from the windows. You can almost see it in your mind, her gloved hand dragging across the glass, her breath visible in the cold. For investigators, that blurry recording would later become one of the last verifiable moments the Matthews family was alive. Imagine yourself driving by that station, catching a glimpse of them. A father working late hours but still making time for Christmas Eve traditions. A mother determined to keep her children warm in the winter rain. Would you have thought twice about that moment? Or would you, like most of us, have dismissed it as just another family on the road? The family continued along I-84, hugging the dark ribbon of the Columbia River. The gorge is treacherous in the best of weather, towering cliffs, sharp curves, and water below that reflects nothing but blackness at night. On December 24th, 2003, it was worse. Fog so thick you couldn't see more than a few car lengths ahead. Truckers later told police they slowed to 30 miles per hour, afraid of slipping on the slick pavement. But the Matthews pressed on, determined to bring home one last Christmas decoration. At 8:00 p.m., they stopped again, this time at a small cafe in Hood River. Warm light spilled from the windows, contrasting sharply with the gloom outside. Inside, patrons later recalled the family entering in a swirl of wet coats and chatter. The 3 children huddled together on a bench, steam rising from their damp jackets as Karen ordered 2 cappuccinos to go. David smiled politely at the barista, his voice calm, almost weary. To the casual observer, nothing seemed unusual. Just a family pausing to warm up before finishing their holiday errand. But pause for a moment. Picture yourself sitting in that cafe. The door creaks open, cold air rushes in, and you watch a family step inside. Their coats drip water, their laughter echoes briefly, and then they vanish back into the night. If you had seen them, would you have remembered their faces 20 years later? Or would they have blurred into the hundreds of strangers you've crossed paths with? The cafe's outdated security system did capture a few minutes of grainy footage, the family walking to the counter, Karen brushing damp hair from her forehead, David nodding politely. Then, at 9, year 0 p.m., the video shows the SUV pulling out of the lot, headlights swallowed instantly by the rain. Those flickering frames became the family's final appearance. From there, the night turns silent. No more credit card transactions. No more cell signals. No more witnesses. The SUV, carrying 5 lives, simply melted into the fog. For the Matthews relatives, Christmas morning began with unease that grew into panic. Rebecca Collins, Karen's sister, dialed their home repeatedly to wish them Merry Christmas. Each ring stretched longer, echoing into emptiness. By afternoon, fear outweighed hope, and she called Portland police, her voice trembling as she reported an entire family missing. That single phone call transformed a quiet holiday into the beginning of one of Oregon's darkest mysteries. Within hours, officers traced the family's confirmed stops, Troutdale, Hood River, but the trail ended abruptly. The road ahead was a blank slate. Think about that. A family of 5, gone without a trace on one of the busiest nights of the year. If it could happen to them, couldn't it happen to anyone? What would you feel if your own relatives disappeared between 2 coffee stops, the highway swallowing every clue? The last night of the Matthews family wasn't marked by violence in plain sight. It was quiet, almost mundane, filling a tank, ordering coffee, buckling children into car seats. Yet, within an hour, that ordinariness transformed into a chilling absence that still echoes today. And as the fog settled deeper into the gorge, the clock struck midnight. Christmas lights blinked back in Portland, but inside the Matthews house, stockings hung untouched, presents unwrapped, and a silence that no holiday cheer could disguise. This was no ordinary disappearance. This was the last night anyone saw the Matthews family alive, a night that would soon ignite desperate searches, unanswered questions, and whispers of something far darker than an accident. By Christmas morning, December 25th, the Matthews family home was glowing with holiday lights, but the inside remained eerily empty. The table was still set with cookies for Santa, gifts lay untouched under the tree, and yet there was no sound of children's laughter. When Karen's sister, Rebecca Collins, dialed again, the phone rang endlessly. That silence was the first crack in what would become one of Oregon's most chilling mysteries. Within hours, Portland police joined Oregon State Troopers to coordinate a full-scale search. Helicopters swept over the Columbia Gorge, their spotlights cutting through the fog. Rescue boats churned the icy water, divers in thick suits braving near-freezing currents. Officers in rain gear trudged along the riverbanks, flashlights slicing through brush and reeds, hoping for a scrap of clothing, a tire mark, anything. But you have to imagine yourself there. The endless gray mist, the sound of churning water, and nothing but silence answering back. No skid marks on the slick pavement. No debris scattered along the roadside. No cell signals pinging towers. No credit card swipes after Hood River. It was as though the Matthews family had been erased from the map. The early theory leaned toward an accident. Perhaps, investigators said, the SUV slid off one of the treacherous curves along I-84, swallowed whole by the Columbia River. It wasn't uncommon for the gorge to claim lives on stormy nights. But as divers groped blindly through freezing darkness, they pulled up only old tires, fishing nets, and rusted debris. Not a trace of the explorer. Not a single clue that an entire family had driven into the river. That vacuum of evidence gnawed at the search teams. Veteran officers admitted privately that it didn't feel right. Accidents leave scars, skid marks, broken railings, floating debris. But here, there was only absence. And here's where you come in as the viewer. Put yourself in Rebecca's shoes. It's Christmas Day. Every house on your street is filled with warmth and family gatherings, yet your sister's home is silent, her phone unanswered, her car and children missing. Wouldn't you demand answers? Wouldn't you press the police to look deeper, even as every passing hour drained hope away? By December 27th, the command center at Multnomah County headquarters was tense and exhausted. Officers crowded around a giant map, red pins marking possible search points. Helicopters had flown dozens of sorties. Dive teams had risked their lives in currents that could sweep a man away in seconds. K-9 units scoured rest stops along the interstate, barking at oil patches later traced to trucks. Still, every report came back the same. Negative. The frustration was palpable. Detectives compared notes: Troutdale gas station at 7, 15 p.m., Hood River Cafe around 8, 00 p.m., then nothing, as if the family had stepped off the map into a void. And yet, in that void, whispers began to circulate. If this wasn't an accident, could it have been something worse? A crime disguised as a disappearance? But in those first 72 hours, the searchers clung to the idea of an accident because the alternative was unbearable. An entire family, including 3 children, doesn't just vanish. Unless someone wanted them to. Unless someone made sure of it. The Columbia River, meanwhile, remained unyielding. From above, its surface looked deceptively calm, reflecting cliffs and fog. Beneath, currents twisted like unseen hands, carrying anything downriver into oblivion. Divers surfaced shaking their heads, masks fogged, muttering about total darkness. One wrote in his logbook, "If the explorer is down here, it's been taken far from sight." Eights. And that's when the first chilling phrase entered the case file. Swept far away. It was underlined twice in the commander's notes. Not a conclusion, but a warning. If the SUV had been pushed or forced into the water, it might lie miles from where anyone was looking. The thought sent a chill through the command post. Because swept far away didn't just describe the river. It described the Matthews family themselves, carried into silence, beyond the reach of loved ones, leaving only questions behind. The Oregonian ran a grim headline. No trace beneath the Columbia, Matthews family still missing. For the community, hope was fading. Candlelight vigils sprang up in Portland, neighbors holding photos of David, Karen, and the children, their faces lit by trembling flames. People whispered prayers, but behind every prayer was a darker thought. What if this wasn't an accident at all? And right here, dear viewer, I need to pause. Because you're not just watching a story, you're walking through it. Imagine standing on that riverbank, the cold mist biting your face, officers nearby shaking their heads. What do you believe? Accident or something far more sinister? If you've stayed with us this far, it means you're drawn to uncovering the truth hidden in these cold case files. And I want to hear from you. If you think this story deserves to be told, drop a 1 in the comments. If you feel it's not worth revisiting, type a 0. Your reaction helps keep stories like this alive, ensuring families like the Matthews are never forgotten. Because here's the haunting truth. After days of searching, investigators found nothing. Not a car. Not a body. Not even a scrap of clothing. And when a search finds nothing, sometimes it means you're looking in the wrong place. Sometimes it means someone wanted it that way. By the fourth day, December 28th, 2003, the Matthews disappearance had already begun to fracture into two competing theories. Officially, Oregon State Police leaned toward a tragic accident. Yet, in hushed conversations at the command post and among neighbors clutching candles at vigils, a darker idea was taking root. What if it wasn't nature that swallowed the Matthews family, but human hands? Investigators faced a bitter dilemma. The Columbia River search had drained manpower and morale. Divers returned with nothing but rusted scrap. Pilots scanned mile after mile of highway and saw no sign of wreckage. Yet a family of 5 does not vanish without a trace, unless someone made sure of it. That possibility, concealment, terrified even seasoned officers. Because an accident, however tragic, offered closure. A deliberate crime meant something else entirely. A killer had watched the Matthews family on Christmas Eve and decided they would never return home. The shift began with a single witness detail. At the Hood River Cafe, a waitress remembered a man in the corner. Broad shoulders, short brown hair, baseball cap pulled low. She recalled the way he gripped his coffee cup, staring at David Matthews with something colder than curiosity. Not just looking, she later told investigators, but watching. When she glanced back after the family left, his chair was empty. It was a thin thread, barely more than a memory, but it complicated everything. Because if the Matthews had simply driven into the river, why had a stranger been watching them? And why had he vanished so quietly? At Multnomah County headquarters, detectives debated late into the night. Accident reports were prepared for the press, but privately, one veteran investigator scribbled in his notebook. If not an accident, then someone planned this. That note, later preserved in the cold case files, became the seed of suspicion that refused to die. You can picture the tension. On one side, exhausted search teams begging to close the river sweep and move on. On the other, detectives staring at the waitress's statement, feeling the gnawing possibility that the Matthews family hadn't been victims of circumstance, but of someone's deliberate act. And here's where you, as the viewer, enter the story. Imagine you're one of those detectives. You've spent 3 days scouring cliffs, riverbanks, and frozen waters, and you've found nothing. Then a waitress describes a man staring at the victim like a predator. Do you dismiss it as coincidence? Or do you feel your gut twist, whispering that this wasn't an accident at all? Publicly, officials reassured Oregon families that all possibilities remained open. Privately, the Matthews case was transforming from a search and rescue into something far more unsettling. Forensic teams examined the cafe's outdated security system, but discovered the footage had already been overwritten, 3 crucial days too late. The only evidence left was one woman's uneasy memory. Still, even a single witness was enough to fracture certainty. By New Year's Eve, the official accident theory was beginning to crumble. Investigators noted that the Explorer's airbags had never deployed, strange for a vehicle supposedly crashing into water at highway speed. They also questioned why no debris floated, why no skid marks marred the road. One detective muttered in frustration, "Cars don't just disappear. People don't just vanish." Eights. The phrase concealed crime began appearing in draft reports. Not confirmed, but whispered like a curse. And in the community, the idea spread quickly. Was it possible the Explorer had been forced off the road? That someone had locked the family inside and left them to drown in silence? Rebecca Collins, Karen's sister, clung to that belief. She told reporters, David didn't have enemies. But if someone was watching him, it wasn't random. Her voice carried both grief and certainty, fueling suspicions in the press. Soon, Oregon headlines shifted. Accident or foul play? Matthews' mystery deepens. Eights. For the detectives who stayed up through rainy nights reviewing notes, the case no longer felt like a tragic misstep on a foggy road. It felt calculated, controlled. Someone had been waiting in the shadows, and the Matthews family had been their target. That chilling possibility was never erased, even when the official investigation slowed in the months ahead. It remained etched in notebooks, whispered in halls, and marked in the margins of the cold case files. Accident or concealed crime. Eights. And now, 2 decades later, we still return to that haunting fork in the road. Because the truth wasn't just about a car lost to the river, it was about intent. And intent, once proven, transforms tragedy into murder. By the time the first week of searching ended, the Matthews investigation had stalled. No explorer. No debris. No bodies. Just a void filled with fog and silence. That's when detectives turned back to the last confirmed place the family had been seen alive, the cafe in Hood River. The cafe was nothing remarkable. A roadside stop with warm yellow lights, a steady stream of truckers, and the smell of burnt coffee lingering in the air. But for investigators, it became the scene of the last ordinary moments in the Matthews' lives. It was here that waitress Linda Carver, then in her early 40s, told police something that changed the tone of the case. She remembered David Matthews standing at the counter, ordering 2 cappuccinos to go. Karen was helping the youngest daughter with her scarf, while the 2 older children whispered about cookies near the display case. A family in motion, warm, alive, ordinary. But Linda's eyes drifted to the far corner of the cafe, where a man sat alone. Broad shoulders, stocky build, short brown hair under a baseball cap. He wasn't sipping his drink, just turning the cup slowly, his knuckles white as he stared at David Matthews with an intensity that unsettled her. It wasn't curiosity, she recalled later. It was something colder, like he was measuring him. Eights. When the family rose to leave, the man's gaze followed them. Linda looked away for only a moment. When she turned back, the corner was empty. His coffee cup sat abandoned, still warm. No one had seen him leave. You have to put yourself in Linda's place. Imagine working a quiet Christmas Eve shift, wiping down tables, when a family enters with laughter and chatter. Then you notice a man who doesn't belong, silent, fixed, his eyes burning into the father's back. Would you brush it off as nothing? Or would you feel that chill climb your spine, the instinct whispering that something was very, very wrong? Detectives pressed her for details. How old? About 40. Hair color? Brown. Any scars, tattoos, marks? None she could recall. His face, she admitted, was partly hidden by the cap's shadow. Still, she was certain about the glare. That wasn't something you forget. Unfortunately, by the time her account reached command, the cafe's outdated security system had already overwritten the footage. In just 3 days, the only objective proof of the stranger's presence was gone forever. The loss infuriated investigators. One scribbled angrily in the margin of his report. Critical oversight, potential suspect erased by time. Eights. But what remained was Linda's conviction. And in cases like these, sometimes one witness becomes the fulcrum between accident and crime. The sketch artist worked with her to produce a drawing. A broad face, deep-set eyes, a neutral cap. Too vague for identification, but haunting nonetheless. When shown to neighbors back in Portland, a few remarked it looked vaguely like Charles Chuck Dawson, the Matthews debt-ridden neighbor who had argued with David 2 months prior. But without physical evidence, the sketch was filed away, just another thread in a growing web of uncertainty. Still, the phrase "the man in the corner" echoed through the investigation. Detectives mentioned it in reports, journalists repeated it in headlines, and the community clung to it in whispered conversations. Who was he? A random trucker? A passing stranger? Or the very person who had followed the Matthews out into the rainy night? This is where you, the viewer, must step closer. Because this story isn't only about facts, it's about instinct. Imagine you're sitting in that cafe, sipping your own coffee. You watch a man stare at a family, not blinking, not smiling. Do you intervene? Do you ask if something's wrong? Or do you sit frozen, uneasy but silent, just like Linda did, and just like most of us probably would? That moment of hesitation could mean the difference between safety and tragedy. Over the years, Linda's account was scrutinized, doubted, even dismissed. Memory fades, critics said. A stressful night can warp perception. But Linda never wavered. "I know what I saw," she insisted. And for Rebecca Collins, hearing her sister's last public sighting described through a stranger's eyes, it felt like vindication. "If someone was watching David," she whispered, "it wasn't random." Eights. And yet, the cafe detail became both the strongest lead and the weakest link. Strong, because it suggested intent, someone targeting the Matthews. Weak, because there was no photo, no video, nothing tangible left to anchor it. Just words scribbled in a notebook and a sketch that blurred with time. That ambiguity became the case's curse. Prosecutors declined to pursue charges. Police, stretched thin, redirected resources. And the Matthews investigation slid from front-page headlines into the growing archive of cold case files, where whispers of "the man in the corner" gathered dust alongside countless unanswered questions. But now, it's your turn. If you believe this detail matters, if you think Linda's memory of a stranger's glare was the key all along, type 1 in the comments. If you think it was coincidence, an unfortunate distraction, type 0. Your reaction helps keep these cases alive, reminding the world that even the smallest detail could unlock the truth. Because sometimes, in the shadowy corners of an ordinary cafe, the difference between chance and murder is just one stare too long. And in the Matthews case, that stare has haunted Oregon for 2 decades. The weeks following the Matthews family's disappearance were a blur of frustration, false leads, and growing despair. Detectives had sketched out theories on whiteboards, pinned maps of the Columbia Gorge, and interviewed dozens of locals. Yet nothing tied neatly together. The explorer hadn't been found, no body surfaced, and the suspicious man at the cafe remained a ghost, described in words, captured in no photograph. By January 2004, the investigation began losing its fire. Patrol cars no longer lined the gorge every morning, helicopters flew less frequently, and the divers, after weeks of risking their lives in murky currents, were reassigned. Officially, the case was still open, but the energy that drives an active manhunt was fading. Unofficially, the Matthews family was becoming a file in a cabinet, a story for anniversaries and quiet conversations in small-town diners. You can imagine the shift. In those early days, every officer moved with urgency, as if finding the explorer was just one more dive away. But as days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, the urgency was replaced with silence. It's a silence you've probably felt before, when a community moves on from tragedy, but the family doesn't. Rebecca Collins refused to move on. She showed up at the precinct daily, sometimes carrying photographs of her sister's smiling children, sometimes begging for updates. "Please don't forget them," she told detectives. Her persistence was both inspiring and painful, because she knew, as did many officers, that once momentum was lost, it was nearly impossible to recover. Theories divided the force. Some clung to the accident explanation. They argued the Columbia River was vast and unforgiving. The explorer might never be found. Others pointed to the witness in the cafe. A man who stared too long, disappeared too quickly, and carried the aura of menace. Without him, the story might have ended in resignation. With him, it was haunted by the possibility of murder. And here's where you, as the viewer, need to lean closer. Imagine you're one of the younger detectives, reviewing the logbooks late at night. You see the underlined notes. Airbags never deployed. Rear lock possibly forced. Witness account unresolved. Do you file it away as unsolvable? Or do you feel a fire in your gut, whispering that this is more than a tragic accident? But institutions don't run on gut feelings alone. They run on budgets, evidence, and politics. By mid-2004, the Matthews investigation had been trimmed back to a skeleton crew. Media coverage faded. Vigils grew smaller. Neighbors whispered that maybe the family had taken a wrong turn. Maybe fate had swallowed them whole. But those whispers hurt Rebecca like knives. "They didn't just vanish," she insisted. Someone made this happen. Eights. Inside the precinct, the case file grew thicker. Pages of reports, grainy photos from gas stations and cafe counters, scribbled witness notes, sonar scans of the riverbed. The weight of the paper was heavy, but none of it added up to proof. And so, the case sat in limbo, not closed, not solved, but suspended in the cruelest category of all. By 2008, with no fresh leads and no new evidence, the inevitable happened. The Matthews file was officially transferred to Oregon's cold case unit. The move was procedural, almost routine, but to the family, it felt like betrayal. Rebecca remembered sitting across from a detective who told her, "We've done everything we can." She walked out of the station clutching her sister's photo, tears streaking down her face. That's when the case earned its dreaded label. Part of the cold case files. For detectives, the phrase meant fewer resources, less manpower, and the quiet resignation that only a miracle or new technology would bring answers. For Rebecca, it meant her family's story would be shelved among hundreds of other tragedies, waiting for someone to care again. The Matthews case remained in that limbo for over a decade. Every Christmas, Rebecca lit candles on her porch, sometimes alone, sometimes joined by a handful of neighbors. "We can't let them fade," she whispered to the night. But the world did fade. Headlines shifted to other crimes. New tragedies claimed the spotlight. The Matthews family became a ghost story whispered in Oregon kitchens, a cautionary tale told in hushed tones. And here's the haunting part for you. Think about how many families like Rebecca's exist in America right now, families who never got answers, who hold vigils while the world moves on. Imagine being that sibling, that aunt, or that parent. Wouldn't you feel the weight of abandonment? Wouldn't you rage against a system that quietly consigns your loved one's story to a folder stamped cold case? When the Oregonian revisited the Matthews case in 2013 for its Unsolved Oregon series, the reporter described the file as dusty but heavy with questions. Retired Detective Daniel Price admitted to the journalist, "We leaned too hard on the accident theory. If it was a crime, we missed our chance to stop him." His voice trembled with regret. That confession reignited interest, but only briefly. Without new evidence, the story slipped back into silence. By then, the Matthews case was known not for answers, but for absence, for what it failed to reveal. It lived, like so many others, in the archives of the cold case files, waiting for a day when persistence, technology, or sheer luck would drag it back into the light. For more than a decade, the Matthews family seemed lost to time. Their names were whispered at Christmas vigils, their faces printed on fading flyers, but their story lived mostly inside the archives of the cold case files. The river that had been searched so desperately in 2003 now flowed on, unbothered, as if guarding its secret. Then, in the fall of 2019, something extraordinary happened, not from police, but from civilians. A group called Oregon Underwater Recovery, made up of volunteer divers and hobby sonar operators, decided to scan the Columbia River again. They weren't detectives, but enthusiasts, men and women who spent their weekends searching for lost boats, discarded vehicles, and sometimes closure for families long ignored. You have to picture it. A small wooden boat bouncing on the gray waves, a portable side-scan sonar rig bolted to its side, computer screens flickering under a makeshift tarp. The Gorge winds cut cold, the kind that slices through jackets and makes your teeth chatter. And on that boat, one diver in particular, Mark Hensley, couldn't stop thinking about the Matthews. He had grown up in Portland, just miles from their old home. He remembered the shock in 2003, the candles, the headlines. Vanished Christmas family. Eights. Now, nearly 20 years later, he was determined to look where others had given up. The sonar emitted its telltale pulse, sending sound waves deep into the Columbia's shifting floor. For hours, the team saw nothing but the usual shapes, fallen trees, old anchors, rock formations. The work was tedious, the kind that numbs your brain with static noise. But suddenly, the screen flickered with a shape that made the crew freeze. Rectangular, boxy, about 4 meters long. 4 rounded corners that looked eerily like wheels. "Stop!" Hensley shouted. "Go back!" Eats. The boat reversed slowly. The sonar sweep repeated. Again, the image emerged, clearer this time. A shadowed silhouette tilted to one side, half buried in river mud. It wasn't driftwood. It wasn't a boulder. It was a vehicle. And in that instant, the boat fell silent. No one said it aloud, but everyone thought the same thing. Had they just found the Matthews Ford Explorer? Now imagine yourself in their position. You're staring at a ghost on a sonar screen, your breath misting in the cold air. Would you believe your eyes? Would you let hope in, or fear what that shadow might reveal? The team marked the GPS coordinates carefully, running several sweeps from different angles to confirm the object's consistency. Each pass returned the same image. A boxy vehicle-like form, resting at a depth of nearly 70 feet. The current tugged at their boat, as if the river itself wanted to swallow the secret again. They knew this wasn't something they could keep to themselves. Within 24 hours, the Oregon State Police received the sonar images. For detectives who had once stood on those cliffs and ordered divers into black water, the pictures were like lightning striking after years of darkness. The coordinates pointed to a section of the Dallas Marina, not far from where the first dives in 2003 had failed. Was this negligence? Bad luck? Or had the river simply hidden its prize until technology caught up? Whatever the answer, the discovery reignited everything. The media caught wind of it almost immediately. Headlines read, "Divers may have found vehicle in Matthews cold case." For Rebecca Collins, the news hit like a thunderclap. She told reporters through tears, "I pray it's them. I just want to bring my family home." Eights. And here's where you, the viewer, need to reflect. How many times have cases like this been left for dead, only for ordinary citizens, people with passion and persistence, to bring them back? Would you, given the chance, join such a search? Would you risk the icy water, the haunting unknown, to find truth where institutions had failed? the sonar ghost was both promise and torment. It gave new life to a case long shelved, but it also raised chilling questions. If this really was the Explorer, what would be inside? Bones? Toys? Evidence of murder? Or nothing at all, just a hollow coffin of rust and river silt? For investigators, the discovery was more than a lead. It was a reckoning. The river they had scoured in 2003 had always held its secret, waiting, patient, silent. And now, through the persistence of civilians, the Columbia had whispered a clue. And if you're still watching this story unfold, I want to ask you, do you think the divers really found the Matthews SUV? If you believe this discovery mattered, type 1 in the comments. If you think it was just another dead end, type 0. Your voice helps decide which of these forgotten stories deserve to stay alive. Because in the end, it wasn't official resources that cracked the silence. It was ordinary people staring at sonar ghosts, daring to believe that even the coldest case can still speak. In late 2019, after the sonar images confirmed a vehicle at the bottom of the Columbia River, Oregon State Police and forensic recovery teams moved quickly. Divers returned with specialized equipment, prepared not just to identify the vehicle, but to bring it to the surface intact. The task was delicate. 2 decades of mud, corrosion, and river currents had made the Explorer fragile, a tomb preserved in silt. The lift operation began at dawn. Floodlights pierced the fog as winches strained, cables tightened, and water surged around the struggling vehicle. Slowly, agonizingly, the Ford Explorer broke through the river's surface, its green paint dulled to black, windows shattered, body caked with mud. For onlookers, the moment was both triumphant and horrifying, closure within reach, yet filled with dread about what might be found inside. When forensic examiners approached the SUV, they treated it not as a car, but as a crime scene frozen in water. Each door was opened carefully, each surface photographed before contact. Inside, silt coated the seats like fine powder, and fragments of clothing clung to rusted metal. In the rear seat, investigators discovered bones, small, fragile, unmistakably belonging to children. The front passenger seat held more skeletal remains, later confirmed to be Karen Matthews. The driver's side contained partial remains consistent with David. The discovery silenced all lingering doubts about whether the family had survived. They had not. The Explorer had become their coffin. But for investigators, answers still demanded questions. How had the vehicle entered the river? Accident or something darker? Forensic analysis began in the Portland State Crime Lab. The bones were carefully cataloged, dried, and compared against dental records. Results confirmed the identities beyond doubt. Alongside the remains, examiners recovered scraps of fabric, corroded jewelry, and a single child's shoe that had resisted decay. Attention then turned to the vehicle itself. Mechanics specializing in forensic reconstruction studied the Explorer's damage. To their surprise, the airbags had not deployed, a red flag suggesting the vehicle had not struck the water at high speed, as an accident would imply. Instead, the trajectory seemed controlled, almost deliberate, as though the SUV had rolled or been pushed into the current. Even more telling was the rear lock. Corrosion made analysis difficult, but under microscopes, faint tool marks became visible. Investigators speculated that the lock had been tampered with before submersion, a possible indicator that someone had ensured the family would remain inside once the car sank. Fingerprints proved elusive after so many years underwater. Still, forensic specialists applied advanced chemical treatments. On a fragment of the passenger side window, partial ridge patterns emerged, too degraded for immediate identification, but enough to suggest a second person had touched the vehicle near the time of its disappearance. DNA analysis provided further revelations. Swabs taken from interior surfaces produced mixed profiles. Most matched the Matthews family. But trace amounts from the rear cargo area did not. They belonged to an unknown male. Modern databases offered no direct match, but the very presence of foreign DNA inside the Explorer suggested intrusion. Investigators also found that the Explorer's gear shift was locked in neutral. Combined with the absence of impact trauma, the finding reinforced the theory that the vehicle had been guided or pushed into the water, not lost in a chaotic accident. The idea of deliberate concealment grew stronger. When these results were presented to prosecutors, the case transformed. What had once been dismissed as a holiday tragedy was now framed as potential homicide. Experts in forensic mechanics, anthropology, and DNA testified that the evidence pointed not to chance, but to intent. The Explorer was no longer just a recovered car. It was the centerpiece of a crime scene resurrected from 2 decades of silence. The findings reopened old suspicions about Charles "Chuck" Dawson, the Matthews neighbor who had long quarreled with David over debts and property boundaries. His name, once buried in the notes, resurfaced with new urgency. Investigators began to re-examine his past statements, his alibis, and his proximity to the family on that final night. For Rebecca Collins, the forensic revelations were bittersweet. They confirmed what she had believed all along. Her sister and nieces and nephew had not simply vanished in a tragic accident. Someone had placed them in that river. Someone had turned Christmas Eve into a cover for murder. The evidence was incomplete, fragile, and hard-won. But after years of silence, science had given the family back its voice. And in that voice was accusation. Quiet, undeniable, and damning. When the Explorer was pulled from the Columbia River and the forensic reports were released, suspicion that had once simmered quietly came roaring back. At the center of that suspicion stood Charles "Chuck" Dawson, the Matthews neighbor, a man with debts, grudges, and a history of volatile temper. Detectives brought him in for questioning in the spring of 2020, nearly 17 years after the family's disappearance. The interrogation room was stark. White walls, a single table, and the hum of a camera recording every move. Dawson, now in his 60s, looked tired but defiant, his hands folded tightly as if trying to hold himself together. The lead investigator slid photos across the table. Images of the Explorer being lifted from the river. Bones cataloged in the lab. Microscopic tool marks on the rear lock. Dawson's jaw tightened as his eyes flicked over the evidence. "You told us back then you hadn't seen the Matthews on Christmas Eve," the detective began. "But a witness placed a man matching your description in the cafe that night. And now we have evidence the vehicle didn't just slide into the river. Someone put it there." "Eights." For a moment, Dawson said nothing. He rubbed his temples, exhaled, and muttered, "I already told you. I was home." Eights. But the pressure mounted. Detectives circled back, asking about his debts, his arguments with David Matthews, his sudden cash payments in January 2004 that didn't match his employment records. The more he denied, the more his story frayed. Now imagine yourself in that room. Fluorescent light buzzing above, every silence stretched thin, every denial punctuated by photos of a drowned family. Would you keep your composure? Or would the weight of evidence crack your defenses? The detectives leaned harder. One placed the waitress's sketch on the table. Another laid down the DNA report, noting the trace sample in the Explorer's cargo area that didn't match any Matthews. It wasn't a direct hit, but it whispered possibility. Dawson's breathing grew heavier. He shifted in his chair, arms crossed, jaw clenched. "You can't prove anything," he snapped. And technically, he was right. After nearly 2 decades, the forensic trail was thin, fragmented, and fragile. But interrogations are not only about proof, they are about pressure. Detectives let silence hang, let his own words echo back at him. They pointed out inconsistencies between his 2003 statements and his 2020 denials. Slowly, cracks appeared. He admitted being in Hood River that night, but insisted it was coincidence. He acknowledged his debts, but claimed David had forgiven him. He couldn't explain the sketch, the timing, or the cash. Piece by piece, his alibi unraveled. And here lies the turning point. For prosecutors, the interrogation wasn't a full confession, but it was enough to shift perception. Dawson was no longer just a name buried in the margins of the cold case files. He was the prime suspect, the man in the corner brought into the light. For the Matthews' surviving relatives, news of the interrogation was both vindication and heartbreak. Rebecca Collins told reporters, "We always knew someone was responsible. Now it feels like we're finally being heard." 8. Public opinion followed swiftly. Neighbors recalled Dawson's temper. Old disputes resurfaced in headlines. Suddenly, the man who had lived quietly on the edge of suspicion for years was thrust under a burning spotlight. The unraveling wasn't explosive. It was slow, methodical, the way truth sometimes seeps through cracks instead of bursting through doors. But the effect was the same. Dawson could no longer hide behind silence. And now, I want to hear from you. If you think the interrogation was the breakthrough moment where the mask finally slipped, drop a 1 in the comments. If you think Dawson's denials still left too much doubt, type 0. Your reaction tells us whether this turning point felt like justice or just another layer of mystery. Because in that stark room, under buzzing lights, a man who had been a shadow for nearly 2 decades was forced to face the weight of evidence, the persistence of family, and the quiet but relentless pursuit of justice. The interrogation may not have ended with a confession, but it cracked something that had long been sealed. Within months, prosecutors convened a grand jury, armed with the forensic findings, financial records, and Dawson's shifting testimony. What had once been whispers now carried the force of law. Charles "Chuck" Dawson was indicted on multiple counts of homicide and evidence tampering. The trial, held in Portland in 2023, drew national attention. For a case that had haunted Oregon for 2 decades, the courtroom became both theater and reckoning. Reporters filled the benches, cameras swarmed outside, and every seat was taken by neighbors, relatives, and strangers who had followed the Matthews mystery for years. Prosecutors laid out their case step by step. They showed the sonar images, the rusted Explorer pulled from the Columbia, and the heartbreaking photographs of bones identified as children. They played recordings of Dawson contradicting himself, denying he'd been in Hood River, then later admitting he had. They introduced the sketch drawn from Linda Carver's memory of the man in the corner, comparing it side by side with Dawson's face. But the most damning evidence came from the mechanics. They testified that the Explorer could not have simply rolled into the river on its own. The lock tampering, the neutral gear shift, the absence of airbag deployment, all pointed to human intervention. Forensic experts in DNA explained the trace mail profile in the cargo area that did not belong to the Matthews family, a silent ghost linking Dawson to the crime scene. The defense fought back, arguing the evidence was circumstantial, degraded by time. They claimed witness memory was unreliable, that sonar shapes were open to interpretation, that tool marks could have come from salvage operations. But the weight of 2 decades, the grief of Rebecca Collins, the persistence of divers, the cold science of forensics pressed against every denial. Imagine yourself sitting in that courtroom. The walls are heavy with silence, broken only by the prosecutor's voice echoing through the chamber. You glance at the jury, watching their faces harden as each piece of evidence stacks higher. Would you doubt what you were hearing? Or would you feel the same chill that swept through the room when the photographs of the explorer were passed to the jury box? In the end, the verdict came swiftly. Guilty. Dawson was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Rebecca, the moment was both relief and sorrow. She stood outside the courthouse, clutching a photo of her sister and the children. "It won't bring them back," she said, her voice breaking, but at least the truth was heard. 8. The aftermath rippled far beyond Oregon. The Matthews case became a touchstone for how persistence and technology can resurrect forgotten tragedies. Police departments nationwide acknowledged the role of civilian divers and volunteer groups who refused to give up when official searches had ended. Law schools dissected the case as an example of circumstantial evidence culminating in justice. Families of the missing looked to Rebecca as proof that hope, however fragile, can endure decades. But the lessons cut deeper. The Matthews family reminded the world that accidents can mask crimes, that silence is not the same as peace, and that even the darkest rivers eventually give up their secrets. For investigators, the case underscored the power of science. Tool mark analysis, degraded DNA, sonar mapping, methods barely feasible in 2003, became decisive in 2019 and beyond. For families, it underscored the necessity of persistence, the refusal to let bureaucracies bury their loved ones in dusty cabinets. And for society, it raised a haunting question. How many other families wait, right now, in the pages of the cold case files, praying for their miracle? This story isn't just about the Matthews. It's about every missing person, every unresolved tragedy, every voice silenced too soon. It's a reminder that justice may be delayed, but it is never entirely denied, not when there are those willing to search, to question, to refuse silence. So now, as the lights fade on this story, it turns to you. What do you believe? Was justice truly served? Did Dawson's conviction answer all the questions, or are there shadows still left unlit? If you felt this story mattered, if you believe the Matthews deserved their day in court, drop a 1 in the comments. If you think too many questions remain unanswered, type 0. And if you want more stories like this, real mysteries, real tragedies, real resilience, subscribe to the channel, tap the bell, and help us keep these voices alive. Because the Matthews family may finally rest, but the search for truth never ends. Somewhere, right now, another family waits in silence. Another case file grows cold. Together, we can make sure they are not forgotten.